the new God of hope, the new gods of hope, the new God of hope, the new goddess of hope, the new goddesses of hope, the new goddess of hope, the old God of hope, the old gods of hope, the old God of hope, the old goddess of hope, the old goddesses of hope, the old goddess of hope, the greater God of hope, the greater gods of hope, the greater God of hope, the greater goddess of hope, the greater goddesses of hope, the greater goddess of hope, the lesser God of hope, the lesser gods of hope, the lesser God of hope, the lesser goddess of hope, the lesser goddesses of hope, the lesser goddess of hope, the higher God of hope, the higher gods of hope, the higher God of hope, the higher goddess of hope, the higher goddesses of hope, the higher goddess of hope, the lower God of hope, the lower gods of hope, the lower God of hope, the lower goddess of hope, the lower goddesses of hope, the lower goddess of hope, the greater spirit of hope, the greater spirits of hope, the greater spirit of hope, the lesser spirit of hope, the lesser spirits of hope, the lesser spirit of hope, the higher spirit of hope, the higher spirits of hope, the higher spirit of hope, the lower spirit of hope, the lower spirits of hope, the lower spirit of hope, the major God of hope, the major gods of hope, the major God of hope, the major goddess of hope, the major goddesses of hope, the major goddess of hope, the minor God of hope, the minor gods of hope, the minor God of hope, the minor goddess of hope, the minor goddesses of hope, the minor goddess of hope, the superior God of hope, the superior gods of hope, the superior God of hope, the superior goddess of hope, the superior goddesses of hope, the superior goddess of hope, the inferior God of hope, the inferior gods of hope, the inferior God of hope, the inferior goddess of hope, the inferior goddesses of hope, the inferior goddess of hope, the ancestor God of hope, the ancestor gods of hope, the ancestor God of hope, the ancestor goddess of hope, the ancestor goddesses of hope, the ancestor goddess of hope, the ascendant God of hope, the ascendant gods of hope, the ascendant God of hope, the ascendant goddess of hope, the ascendant goddesses of hope, the ascendant goddess of hope, the descendant God of hope, the descendant gods of hope, the descendant God of hope, the descendant goddess of hope, the descendant goddesses of hope, the descendant goddess of hope, the transcendent God of hope, the transcendent gods of hope, the transcendent God of hope, the transcendent goddess of hope, the transcendent goddesses of hope, the transcendent goddess of hope, the past God of hope, the past gods of hope, the past God of hope, the past goddess of hope, the past goddesses of hope, the past goddess of hope, the present God of hope, the present gods of hope, the present God of hope, the present goddess of hope, the present goddesses of hope, the present goddess of hope, the future God of hope, the future gods of hope, the future God of hope, the future goddess of hope, the future goddesses of hope, the future goddess of hope, the authentic God of hope, the authentic gods of hope, the authentic God of hope, the authentic goddess of hope, the authentic goddesses of hope, the authentic goddess of hope, the synthetic God of hope, the synthetic gods of hope, the synthetic God of hope, the synthetic goddess of hope, the synthetic goddesses of hope, the synthetic goddess of hope, the progressive God of hope, the progressive gods of hope, the progressive God of hope, the progressive goddess of hope, the progressive goddesses of hope, the progressive goddess of hope, the regressive God of hope, the regressive gods of hope, the regressive God of hope, the regressive goddess of hope, the regressive goddesses of hope, the regressive goddess of hope, the ordinary God of hope, the ordinary gods of hope, the ordinary God of hope, the ordinary goddess of hope, the ordinary goddesses of hope, the ordinary goddess of hope, the extraordinary God of hope, the extraordinary gods of hope, the extraordinary God of hope, the extraordinary goddess of hope, the extraordinary goddesses of hope, the extraordinary goddess of hope, the static god of hope, the static gods of hope, the static god of hope, the static goddess of hope, the static goddesses of hope, the static goddess of hope, the dynamic god of hope, the dynamic gods of hope, the dynamic god of hope, the dynamic goddess of hope, the dynamic goddesses of hope, the dynamic goddess of hope, the land god of hope, the land gods of hope, the land god of hope, the land goddess of hope, the land goddesses of hope, the land goddess of hope, the sea god of hope, the sea gods of hope, the sea god of hope, the sea goddess of hope, the sea goddesses of hope, the sea goddess of hope, the sky god of hope, the sky gods of hope, the sky god of hope, the sky goddess of hope, the sky goddesses of hope, the sky goddess of hope, the god of hope, the gods of hope, the god of hope, the goddess of hope, the goddesses of hope, the goddess of hope, the half god of hope, the half gods of hope, the half god of hope, the half goddess of hope, the half goddesses of hope, the half goddess of hope, the vessel of hope, the vessels of hope, the vessel of hope, the name of hope, the names of hope, the name of hope, the person of hope, the persons of hope, the person of hope, the persona of hope, the personas of hope, the persona of hope, the personage of hope, the personages of hope, the personage of hope, the personality of hope, the personalities of hope, the personality of hope, the personification of hope, the personifications of hope, the personification of hope, the image of hope, the images of hope, the image of hope, the imagination of hope, the imaginations of hope, the imagination of hope, the belief of hope, the beliefs of hope, the belief of hope, the thought of hope, the thoughts of hope, the thought of hope, the word of hope, the words of hope, the word of hope, the action of hope, the actions of hope, the action of hope, the reaction of hope, the reactions of hope, the reaction of hope, the feeling of hope, the feelings of hope, the feeling of hope, the situation of hope, the situations of hope, the situation of hope, the circumstance of hope, the circumstances of hope, the circumstance of hope, the environment of hope, the environments of hope, the environment of hope, the relationship of hope, the relationships of hope, the relationship of hope, the number of hope, the numbers of hope, the number of hope, the formula of hope, the formulas of hope, the formula of hope, the equation of hope, the equations of hope, the equation of hope, the theory of hope, the theories of hope, the theory of hope, the symbol of hope, the symbols of hope, the symbol of hope, the color of hope, the colors of hope, the color of hope, the thing of hope, the things of hope, the thing of hope, the way of hope, the ways of hope, the way of hope, the place of hope, the places of hope, the place of hope, the time of hope, the times of hope, the time of hope, the event of hope, the events of hope, the event of hope, the result of hope, the results of hope, the result of hope, the crown of hope, the crowns of hope, the crown of hope, the throne of hope, the thrones of hope, the throne of hope, the hope king, the hope kings, the hope kingdom, the hope kingdoms, the hope king subject, the hope king subjects, the hope king's dominion, the hope king's dominions, the kingdom of hope, the kingdoms of hope, the kingdom of hope, the hope queen, the hope queens, the hope queendom, the hope queendoms, the hope queen subject, the hope queen subjects, the hope queen's dominion, the hope queen's dominions, the queendom of hope, the queendoms of hope, the queendom of hope, the hope prince, the hope princes, the hope princedom, the hope princedoms, the hope prince's subject, the hope prince's subjects, the hope prince's dominion, the hope prince's dominions, the princedom of hope, the princedoms of hope, the princedom of hope, the hope princess, the hope princesses, The Hope Princess Dom. The Hope Princess Doms. The Hope Princess is subject. The Hope Princess is subjects. The Hope Princess is dominion. The Hope Princess is dominions. The Princess Dom of Hope. The Princess Doms of Hope. The Princess Dom of Hope. The Lord of Hope. The Lords of Hope. The Lord of Hope. The Lordess of Hope. The Lordesses of Hope. The Lordess of Hope. The Priest of Hope. The Priests of Hope. The Priest of Hope. The Priestess of Hope. The Priestesses of Hope. The Priestess of Hope. The Ritual of Hope. The Rituals of Hope. The Ritual of Hope. The Shrine of Hope. The Shrines of Hope. The Shrine of Hope. The Temple of Hope. The Temples of Hope. The Temple of Hope. The Leader of Hope. The Leaders of Hope. The Leader of Hope. The Follower of Hope. The Followers of Hope. The Follower of Hope. The Natural Substance of Hope. The Natural Substances of Hope. The Natural Substance of Hope. The Supernatural Substance of Hope. The Supernatural Substances of Hope. The Supernatural Substance of Hope. The Temporal Substance of Hope. The Temporal Substances of Hope. The Temporal Substance of Hope. The Spiritual Substance of Hope. The Spiritual Substances of Hope. The Spiritual Substance of Hope. The Natural Form of Hope. The Natural Forms of Hope. The Natural Form of Hope. The Supernatural Form of Hope. The Supernatural Forms of Hope. The Supernatural Form of Hope. The Temporal Form of Hope. The Temporal Forms of Hope. The Temporal Form of Hope. The Spiritual Form of Hope. The Spiritual Forms of Hope. The Spiritual Form of Hope. The Age of Hope. The Ages of Hope. The Age of Hope. The Era of Hope. The Eras of Hope. The Era of Hope. The Awakener of Hope. The Awakeners of Hope. The Awakener of Hope. The Awakening of Hope. The Awakenings of Hope. The Awakening of Hope. The Realm of Hope. The Realms of Hope. The Realm of Hope. The Dimension of Hope. The Dimensions of Hope. The Dimension of Hope. The Zone of Hope. The Zones of Hope. The Zone of Hope. The Frequency of Hope. The Frequencies of Hope. The Frequency of Hope. The Century of Hope. The Centuries of Hope. The Century of Hope. The Millennium of Hope. The Millenniums of Hope. The Millennium of Hope. The Purpose of Hope. The Purposes of Hope. The Purpose of Hope. The Meaning of Hope. The Meanings of Hope. The Meaning of Hope. The Culture of Hope. The Cultures of Hope. The Culture of Hope. The Demonstrator of Hope. The Demonstrators of Hope. The Demonstrator of Hope. The Demonstration of Hope. The Demonstrations of Hope. The Demonstration of Hope. The Manifester of Hope. The Manifestors of Hope. The Manifester of Hope. The Manifestation of Hope. The Manifestations of Hope. The Manifestation of Hope. The Presence of Hope. The Presences of Hope. The Presence of Hope. The Glow of Hope. The Glows of Hope. The Glow of Hope. The Goal of Hope. The Goals of Hope. The Goal of Hope. The Plan of Hope. The Plans of Hope. The Plan of Hope. The Book of Hope. The Books of Hope. The Book of Hope. The Philosopher of Hope. The Philosophers of Hope. The Philosopher of Hope. The Philosophy of Hope. The Philosophies of Hope. The Philosophy of Hope. The Releaser of Hope. The Releasers of Hope. The Releaser of Hope. The Release of Hope. The Releases of Hope. The Release of Hope. The Variable of Hope. The Variables of Hope. The Variable of Hope. The Cause of Hope. The Causes of Hope. The Cause of Hope. The Effect of Hope. The Effects of Hope. The Effect of Hope. The Journey of Hope. The Journeys of Hope. The Journey of Hope. The Emergence of Hope. The Emergences of Hope. The Emergence of Hope. The Source of Hope. The Sources of Hope. The Source of Hope. The Originator of Hope. The Originators of Hope. The Originator of Hope. The Origin of Hope. The Origins of Hope. The Origin of Hope. The Forefather of Hope. The Forefathers of Hope. The Forefather of Hope. The Foremother of Hope. The Foremothers of Hope. The Foremother of Hope. The Ancestor of Hope. The Ancestors of Hope. The Ancestor of Hope. The Descendant of Hope. The Descendants of Hope. The Descendant of Hope. the lineage of hope, the lineages of hope, the lineage of hope, the heritage of hope, the heritages of hope, the heritage of hope, the heir of hope, the heirs of hope, the heir of hope, the co-heir of hope, the co-heirs of hope, the co-heir of hope, the joint heir of hope, the joint heirs of hope, the joint heir of hope, the dynasty of hope, the dynasties of hope, the dynasty of hope, the force of hope, the forces of hope, the force of hope, the law of hope, the laws of hope, the law of hope, the pact of hope, the pacts of hope, the pact of hope, the game of hope, the games of hope, the game of hope, the mask of hope, the masks of hope, the mask of hope, the armor of hope, the armors of hope, the armor of hope, the sword of hope, the swords of hope, the sword of hope, the shield of hope, the shields of hope, the shield of hope, the force shield of hope, the force shields of hope, the force shield of hope, the armored force shield of hope, the armored force shields of hope, the armored force shield of hope, the champion of hope, the champions of hope, the champion of hope, the guardian of hope, the guardians of hope, the guardian of hope, the defender of hope, the defenders of hope, the defender of hope, the protector of hope, the protectors of hope, the protector of hope, the chant of hope, the chants of hope, the chant of hope, the shape of hope, the shapes of hope, the shape of hope, the cube of hope, the cubes of hope, the cube of hope, the cuboid of hope, the cuboids of hope, the cuboid of hope, the sphere of hope, the spheres of hope, the sphere of hope, the spheroid of hope, the spheroids of hope, the spheroid of hope, the prism of hope, the prisms of hope, the prism of hope, the pyramid of hope, the pyramids of hope, the pyramid of hope, the cylinder of hope, the cylinders of hope, the cylinder of hope, the cone of hope, the cones of hope, the cone of hope, the triangle of hope, the triangles of hope, the triangle of hope, the circle of hope, the circles of hope, the circle of hope, the semicircle of hope, the semicircles of hope, the semicircle of hope, the square of hope, the squares of hope, the square of hope, the rectangle of hope, the rectangles of hope, the rectangle of hope, the parallelogram of hope, the parallelograms of hope, the parallelogram of hope, the rhombus of hope, the rhombuses of hope, the rhombus of hope, the trapezoid of hope, the trapezoids of hope, the trapezoid of hope, the polygon of hope, the polygons of hope, the polygon of hope, the pentagon of hope, the pentagons of hope, the pentagon of hope, the hexagon of hope, the hexagons of hope, the hexagon of hope, the septagon of hope, the septagons of hope, the septagon of hope, the octagon of hope, the octagons of hope, the octagon of hope, the nonagon of hope, the nonagons of hope, the nonagon of hope, the decagon of hope, the decagons of hope, the decagon of hope, the evolution of hope, the evolutions of hope, the evolution of hope, the revolution of hope, the revolutions of hope, the revolution of hope, the elemental art of hope, the elemental arts of hope, the elemental art of hope, the elemental science of hope, the elemental sciences of hope, the elemental science of hope, the elemental principle of hope, the elemental principles of hope, the elemental principle of hope, the elemental technology of hope, the elemental technologies of hope, the elemental technology of hope, the low elemental art of hope, the low elemental arts of hope, the low elemental art of hope, the low elemental science of hope, the low elemental sciences of hope, the low elemental science of hope, the low elemental principle of hope, the low elemental principles of hope, the low elemental principle of hope, the low elemental technology of hope, the low elemental technologies of hope, the low elemental technology of hope, the high elemental art of hope, the high elemental arts of hope, the high elemental art of hope, the high elemental science of hope, the high elemental sciences of hope, the high elemental science of hope, the high elemental principle of hope, the high elemental principles of hope, the high elemental principle of hope, the high elemental technology of hope, the high elemental technologies of hope, the high elemental technology of hope, the agent of hope, the agents of hope, the agent of hope, the agency of hope, the agencies of hope, the agency of hope, the amplifier of hope, the amplifiers of hope, the amplifier of hope, the amplification of hope, the amplifications of hope, the amplification of hope, the enhancer of hope, the enhancers of hope, the enhancer of hope, the enhancement of hope, the enhancements of hope, the enhancement of hope, the magnifier of hope, the magnifiers of hope, the magnifier of hope, the magnification of hope, the magnifications of hope, the magnification of hope, the influencer of hope, the influencers of hope, the influencer of hope, the influence of hope, the influences of hope, the influence of hope, the emanator of hope, the emanators of hope, the emanator of hope, the emanation of hope, the emanations of hope, the emanation of hope, the converger of hope, the convergers of hope, the converger of hope, the convergence of hope, the convergences of hope, the convergence of hope, the aura of hope, the auras of hope, the aura of hope, the impression of hope, the impressions of hope, the impression of hope, the intelligence of hope, the intelligences of hope, the intelligence of hope, the sophistication of hope, the sophistications of hope, the sophistication of hope, the genius of hope, the geniuses of hope, the genius of hope, the polymath of hope, the polymaths of hope, the polymath of hope, the psychic of hope, the psychics of hope, the psychic of hope, the knowledge of hope, the knowledges of hope, the knowledge of hope, the understanding of hope, the understandings of hope, the understanding of hope, the wisdom of hope, the wisdoms of hope, the wisdom of hope, the secret of hope, the secrets of hope, the secret of hope, the mystery of hope, the mysteries of hope, the mystery of hope, the revelation of hope, the revelations of hope, the revelation of hope, the tactic of hope, the tactics of hope, the tactic of hope, the strategy of hope, the strategies of hope, the strategy of hope, the strength of hope, the strengths of hope, the strength of hope, the might of hope, the mights of hope, the might of hope, the power of hope, the powers of hope, the power of hope, the authority of hope, the authorities of hope, the authority of hope, the dominion of hope, the dominions of hope, the dominion of hope, the rhythm of hope, the rhythms of hope, the rhythm of hope, the melody of hope, the melodies of hope, the melody of hope, the music of hope, the musics of hope, the music of hope, the lyric of hope, the lyrics of hope, the lyric of hope, the song of hope, the songs of hope, the song of hope, the dance of hope, the dances of hope, the dance of hope, the spirit of hope, the spirits of hope, the spirit of hope, the soul of hope, the souls of hope, the soul of hope, the body of hope, the bodies of hope, the body of hope, the mark of hope, the marks of hope, the mark of hope, the promise of hope, the promises of hope, the promise of hope, the visionary of hope, the visionaries of hope, the visionary of hope, the vision of hope, the visions of hope, the vision of hope, the picture of hope, the pictures of hope, the picture of hope, the sound of hope, the sounds of hope, the sound of hope, the tongue of hope, the tongues of hope, the tongue of hope, the language of hope, the languages of hope, the language of hope, the communication of hope, the communications of hope, the communication of hope, the people of hope, the peoples of hope, the people of hope, the society of hope, the societies of hope, the society of hope, the fortress of hope, the fortresses of hope, the fortress of hope, the government of hope, the governments of hope, the government of hope, the city of hope, the cities of hope, the city of hope, the nation of hope, the nations of hope, the nation of hope, the civilization of hope, the civilizations of hope, the civilization of hope, the world of hope, the worlds of hope, the world of hope,